Thanks for having me here. It's great to be in New York City today. So I'm Steve Vassallo, and I'm an investor in Silicon Valley. But in a former life, I was a product designer at a company called IDEO. And in the 5.5 years that I worked at IDEO, I worked on everything from furniture to sunglasses to anesthesia delivery devices to this, the last great desk phone for Cisco. Now, I loved being a designer, and I still design and build things in my spare time. But after more than half a decade, I figured out that I wanted to do more than just pure craft. I wanted to get on the path to starting my own company. And at the time, there just weren't that many resources for entrepreneurs or designers who wanted to be entrepreneurs. And eventually, I found my way with some guidance from some really amazing people. Now, like so many of you, and I felt this in Stephen's presentation, I sort of feel like I was a designer before I knew being a designer was an actual thing. And while I was super happy to sort of build cool things, I didn't know a lick about business. I didn't know a lick about what was required to actually build a company. And so as an investor, when I meet young entrepreneurs today who also want to have a bigger impact or have that itch to start something, they don't seem much more prepared than I was when I was trying to do this 20 years ago. Outside of communities like this and a couple of others, there just aren't that many resources out there for designers to sort of figure out how to level up. There's lots of sort of industry observations. There's lots of sort of high-level statistics about job openings on LinkedIn and numbers of billion-dollar designer-founded companies, but just not a lot of substantive and sort of practical insight about what's required for designers to actually level up to become designer founders. What do you all have to figure out if you want to become the next Joe Gebbia of Airbnb or want to be the next Evan Sharp of Pinterest? So I decided I wanted to do something about that and help them. So I wrote this book called The Way to Design, which you can download on thewaytodesign.com, and we've got a few copies here today. And I think about it as a guidebook. So the three things I wanted to cover in the book were really around how to go from becoming a designer to becoming a designer founder, how to build a design-centered and design-led company, and then how to use design to make a real and significant impact in the world. To write the book, I spoke with 50 designer founders, designers, design historians, design scholars, and today I want to give you kind of a quick bounce on what I learned from this experience. So I'm going to hit two things. Number one, guide you through how design got to where it is. You got a bit of that, I think, from Stephen's presentation. And then point the way forward for designers who actually want to become designer founders. So let's start with a very brief recap on how design got to where it is today. So when I started in Silicon Valley as a product designer, design wasn't really held in high regard. In fact, David Kelly, who's the founder of IDEO, used to say that designers were most often thought of as the people that you brought in the 11th hour to basically make what the engineers had conceived of look prettier. Design was too often an afterthought, if it was a thought at all. And success was so much more a function of a company's kind of technology prowess, of whether it was a faster computing power or whether it had more and more features. But things have definitely changed, and changed dramatically in the past 2 decades. And what used to be the last thing that was bolted on is now the first. And why is that? So in many ways, technology is at an equilibrium point. If you look at network speeds, they've gone from 1 gig to 10 gigs to 100 gigs. And we're now approaching, however, the limits of optical lithography. Literally, you can't put more transistors on a microchip. So we're sort of seeing the end of Moore's law. And even if we assume that we can eke out another 10 years of this and then make the leap to some form of quantum computing, it's still the case that sort of the fundamental software infrastructure has been commoditized, and that the real differentiation is happening at the end interface with users, which is a great thing for you all, of course. And I think this is particularly evident in the consumer internet world, where the marginal cost of software literally is zero, and design has become the differentiator. So my first project at IDEO was designing Nike's first line of performance sunglasses. And when I got set up for that project, I had a $15,000 workstation and a $20,000 CAD package that was sold by really expensive sales reps and had weeks of training, My prototype glasses cost $50,000 to make in machine shops that had equipment that was well upwards of sort of $500,000. And then when we were ready to release those products for mass manufacture, we would basically send drawings and CAD files to the other side of the world, where kind of 12 weeks later, these tool makers would basically hog out hardened steel molds and send us our first parts. But if you're a product designer today, you get started with free software. We talked about that earlier. Make your first rapid prototype from your own desktop MakerBot. You can raise $100,000 in crowdfunding. You can purchase soft tools from PCH International for $5,000 instead of $500,000. And you can start to market and sell your product from your own website with your own voice. It's pretty different. So what does the huge future hold for these product designers? So this cool shoe is from a company called Carbon. It was started by my friend Joe DeSimone. And Carbon allows you to actually take 3D scans of your feet and then custom print these midsoles that are precisely designed for your own weight and gait and your own fitness applications. So instead of having a size 9, you get like a size Lulu or a size U. So it's very, very customized. And product design is going to be about really the sort of the software interface to interacting with these kinds of products. Now, the second thing that's radically changed is in consumers' expectations. So it used to be that businesses weren't penalized if they had a weak emphasis on design. Even if you had a poorly designed product, Oracle was a great example of that in databases, or Cisco even in networking gear. If you had ferocious sales and marketing, you could still sell hundreds of millions of anything. It was very humbling for me when I first figured that out. But that really, I think, is a thing of the past. Thanks to the work of people like Steve Jobs and David Kelly and Bill Moggridge, consumers demand a lot more. The iPhone, which, as you all know, sold its billionth unit last August and is approaching its 10th anniversary later this month, is already the most successful product of our time. But most importantly, I think it changed all of our expectations about what we expect from products. We want them to be masterfully designed. We want the technology to be very, very delightful to use. And for average consumers, design is now non-negotiable. Again, a huge shift for you all. But I think the third reason that design has really come into the forefront is that the very meaning of what design is has actually changed. So design used to be about the veneer. As I said, these sort of 11th hour styling exercises, these pretty pixels, drop shadows, elegant edges. But it's not that anymore. Design is the what, and this came out in the book. What should you be building? What problem do you want to solve? What positive change do you want to affect in the world? In a world in which you can build anything, and it's true, you can literally build anything today, the burden for entrepreneurs has actually shifted from if you can build something to whether you should actually be building it in the first place. As Evan Sharp says here, where engineering is about capability, what we could do, design is all about suitability, what we should do. Design is a messy, holistic, human-attuned process for solving problems, not stylistic ones, but problems of all manner and level of importance. And it's designers who serve that special bridge between the user, the technology, and the business. So these three developments have really led to this moment where design has come into its own. And this is the best time in history to be a designer. Large incumbents like Samsung and GE and IBM, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build design studios and hire thousands of designers. You guys have seen this. Google has kind of reinvented itself as a design-centric business. They're multi-billion-dollar startups now that have been built by offering basically better designed products on top of very familiar technology. So don't take my word for it or their word for it or Harvard or Stanford's for it. Just look at what's going on in the ecosystem. So on the ground, this is San Francisco. Venture-backed startups founded by designers are exploding. This is the last 10 years. I interviewed many of the successful designer founders as well as some of the first-time ones for the book. And then, of course, look at what's happening right here in New York City. So that brings me to what I think the future of design will be. If it's not already apparent, I believe that design is the greatest lever for building the greatest companies to come. And it's my conviction that this will be the century of the designer founder. When core value creation doesn't come from an unimpeachable technical founder, but rather from entrepreneurs who have a deeper, more fundamental sense of the human condition. But the problem is not enough designers realize how essential design is to modern business, or how much more of a massive impact their kind of crazy mutant ninja powers could have on the world. And many of the ones who do just aren't ready to sort of start that journey. They're not ready to be successful founders yet. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I worked on the book. Because I think the world needs way more of you guys, like 10x more. So to go from a designer to a designer founder, you need to understand how to scale up in 3 ways: the individual, the organizational, and this global. So in my book, I break down 5 things that individual designers need to do to level up. We don't have time to hit all of them today, but I'll just hit on one of them, and that's this notion of breaking out of the craft box. So what do I mean by the craft box? Of the scores of founders whom I spoke with for The Way to Design, this was the #1 failure mode. This notion of how can I let go of this sort of stubborn perfectionism, this molecular level attention to detail that you're like all blessed with and cursed with. And I totally get it, because I feel it. I feel that like tractor beam of compulsion. When I see something that's out of sorts, I want to fix it too. But if you're building a business, you can't solely be a craftsperson. You have to wisely pick and choose when you can be obsessive about something and when a solution that's kind of good enough is good enough to actually ship and get into the wild. As Joe said here, to be a designer founder, you're going to have to let go of the perfection, the craftsmanship, or whatever you want to call it, because a designer versus a manager are 2 different mindsets. So I can't overemphasize this importance of breaking out of the craft box, and nearly all the designer founders I spoke with said they struggled with this. But let me be clear, I'm not saying to let go of design. The whole point, after all, is that you're not just a founder, you're a designer founder. You're bringing something special to these companies. But it's not all about you. Designer founders also have to level up at the organizational level. You have to become a builder of design teams and a design-led company. And this requires a totally different set of skills. How to facilitate among different stakeholders, how to assess viability and feasibility, recruiting and hiring, communicating your findings, boosting the organizational influence, setting up lightweight processes. And you need to find the proper ratio of tweaking pixels to executing strategy, because your company is your craft now. So back when I was at IDEO, we used to display our favorite products in these like glass trophy cases. You'd literally kind of go into the lobby and see like old versions of Eli Lilly pens and things we worked on for Apple, and we were super proud of our designs. But the danger in fetishizing the product is that this creates this sort of false impression that design is this finite or definite thing, kind of this bullseye that you hit and then call it a day. But design isn't something that you can kind of keep trapped under glass or bottle it up. It's that the product is a point, but it's not the point. It is one point in time. Or as I like to say, product market fit is a liquid, not a solid. And what I mean by this is that achieving product market fit is a great thing. There are a lot of companies who never get there, but it's a transitory achievement. It's a false summit of sorts, because your customers want more, the competitive landscape changes, new technology enables new functions or form factors. The goal here is not to achieve product market fit, but to achieve a regular drumbeat of many product market fits. And I think that requires processes. So what really matters to modern companies is building those methods and processes for many, many multiple rounds of problem solving and creativity and iteration, which means that every startup needs to design not just a great product, but a process for continuously designing great products, or what I think about as a system for repeatable genius. And what this system will look like, and I realize you can't see any of that from here, will vary from company to company. This is actually a leveling up framework, which is one of the favorite bits that I have in the book. And it was developed by Heather Phillips, who's at the Designer Fund, where I'm an investor and an advisor. And it's a really terrific synthesis of how to scale design in your companies. Doesn't make sense to get into the detail, but the moral of the table is that designer founders need to inject as much intention into designing and developing your teams and your processes as you inject into the products. And that's a different mindset. And finally, aspiring designer founders need to wrap their heads around the global context. So the world, of course, has become infinitely more complex and intertwined. Just since the last 15 years, we now generate 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. We're halfway to connecting the whole planet, and in the next few years, 80% of adults will have a smartphone in their pocket. So we live in this massively complex and very intricately connected system. And it's increasingly impossible to be a designer or even a human being without taking account for how we affect and are affected by this whole sort of organic machine. Which is why I think design thinking, which emphasizes solving problems from a human-centered approach, actually needs to look wider towards a humanity-centered approach, incorporating another body of thought, systems thinking. Now, systems thinking isn't actually a new idea. It's actually something that's been around. It may be unfamiliar to you, but it's really a kind of got newfound relevance, I think, with the big data, everything is connected world that we live in. And fundamentally, it's a mindset that recognizes the interconnectedness of everything. It's about seeing relationships between collections of interdependent parts and then the consequences that they have, whereby those connections and consequences are just as important as those individual parts. So what is that exactly? Well, let me tell you using one of my favorite frameworks in systems thinking, which is this concept of the iceberg model. This is probably something Stephen's seen in the past. But at the top of the iceberg is this notion of events. So these are sort of incidents that you encounter from day to day. This is sort of the hurly-burly of life. And then patterns are these things just below the surface. So these are kind of the accumulated observations or habits that you have, memories from sort of lots of unconsidered reactions to those events above the waterline. And then there's this notion underneath them of structures. This is sort of how are the components organized. And these underpin both those patterns and those incidents, those events. And then, of course, at the very base of this is our values. What is our vision for the future? So let me share a quick story about how this tied to sort of something at Foundation. I'm sure every single one of you has been in a bad meeting, maybe even one that you were leading. So a few weeks ago, one of my partners kind of called us out at the end of one of our Monday afternoon pitches and said, like, this wasn't a good meeting. And he sort of pointed out 3 or 4 different events. 2 people had been sort of checking email in the middle of the meeting. Another person literally left to go to the washroom. Someone else just had low energy. And we kind of looked at all these different ways, these different events, if you will, that the meeting didn't go great. And while we didn't agree on which ones were kind of the most sort of insulting, if you will, what we all agreed on was that there was this pattern of inattentiveness that we didn't like and wasn't consonant with our values of respect for those entrepreneurs. So we spent some time building some structures. We brainstormed literally, what are some guidelines that we can have for meetings so that we can actually improve those events so that they reflected our values. And so we basically re-architected our Mondays. We sort of have now rules around no laptops or even phones in our meetings. We actually have our administrative partner who takes notes for all of us. And then we literally flipped our days around. So we take our Monday morning meetings, our Monday meetings in the morning instead of the afternoon because people were literally getting tired after lunch. So we changed the structures to sort of reinforce the behaviors and the things that we wanted to see. And I think design has so many parallels in this regard because so often we're tempted to look at events and make reactions or propose designs that are addressing symptoms rather than root causes or system failures. Now, there are several other relevant concepts in systems thinking, and there just aren't enough minutes here to kind of give them justice. But let me hit on one more. And that is that designers really need to more carefully consider this interplay between components in a system. And why is that? So they're inextricably connected, as I talked about before. And it's no longer possible or even wise to sort of design a part without thinking about the sum of the parts. So the trick here is to analyze systems with an eye towards leverage points. This is sort of like acupuncture for your products and your systems, where there's this idea that a small nudge over here can have a large effect somewhere else. And so it's often the case that you can do something, rather than doing a wholesale change of your design, you can make a subtle, almost subterranean adjustment that will have exactly desired effect that you wanted, and is also sort of addressing the root causes. So if I were to ask you guys, like, what do you think is the best design airline? So many of you, I'm guessing, would say it's Virgin, because they have like killer lights in the cabins, and their pilots have cool jackets, and their like safety video is pretty awesome. But if you looked at it from a systems perspective, I think you'd actually say it's Southwest. And the reason I bring this up is that they looked at leverage points. They looked at opportunities to both unload and load the plane much more effectively, so that passengers were actually happier, and they were making better use of the infrastructure that they had. They were higher efficiency. And they've become basically the only consistently profitable airline in history. So what does this all mean? And why do I believe that more designer founders need to exist? Because I think designers are the key. As the world grows more complex and uncertain, I believe that designers have both a moral obligation and a unique ability to take on the world's greatest challenges, to address real-world problems rather than just burying your head in the pixelated sand. Most of the things, the calamities that we face, are systemic ones, which have been caused by an insufficient understanding of what is fundamentally human, for how people engage with and are impacted by each other in the world. So many of these woes could be alleviated and even cured by building solutions that truly are human-centered, and no one is better equipped to do that than designers. So let me just end with a quick video that hopefully brings this all together, and we'll call it done.
When people think of design, they often think an elegant chair, a well-turned logo, dramatic architecture. But that isn't all that design is. Design is more. It's more than the drapes or the drop shadows, more than a beautiful UI or a rad concept car. Design is more than aesthetics, much more. Design is fundamental. It's the predilection to investigate and understand. It's the compulsion to give form to ideas and make sense of disorder. Design is the ability to amend the imperfect. Design is knowing what questions to ask and how to ask them. What's the right problem to solve? How do I solve it? Why should I solve it? In a world in which anyone can now build anything, design is understanding whether something is worth building at all. If you've ever built, tested, shipped, debugged, rebuilt, or reshipped anything, then you're a designer. And there has never been a better moment in history to be a designer. Now is your time to solve real and important problems, to start great and enduring companies, to use curiosity, creativity, and craft to elevate lives. Because design at its core is optimistic. It's the call to change what is into what ought to be. It is the attempt to make heart and mind into tools of mass construction, to build a better, wiser, more just, more beautiful world. Design is your gift and your responsibility. Design is the way.
And that's it. Thanks, folks. Time. Yeah.
Let's do a couple of questions. So, I have to right off the bat, looking back at the designer founder, at what point do you encourage them to bring in professional design leadership? Is there a point where they kind of need to hand over the reins of the actual product design to executive?
Great question, and I will tell you that it was fun to ask that question of Evan Sharp, and you guys are investors, but it was really great to hear his response, which was he could let go of design as soon as he hired someone better than himself at design, which, by the way, he admits was like, he doesn't claim to be the world's greatest designer. And that freed him up to basically focus on all of these things in the adjacent disciplines and focus on scaling design in his company, which they haven't let go of, as you know. But I think in many ways it is about sort of finding someone who can sort of free you up to not get sort of effectively drowned down by all of the other things that are requirements of being a great founder, of figuring out how to enter the market, of figuring out how to scale your sales organization. And but I think the key is, as soon as you find someone where like you're looking over to the design section of your company and you actually don't feel panicked, you actually feel good. That's when you know you're in a good spot.
How do you interview a design leader?
I think for myself, and I think certainly I coach the executives that I work with to very quickly focus on the projects, the things that they've worked on, not the things necessarily that are like the giant, what are the descriptions of the giant initiatives, but what specific things and decisions and insights and attributes of this project were different because you were involved with it. And those kinds of sort of examples of the projects and the initiatives that they worked on, I think, have been the best way to kind of unpack that.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool.
Questions? With the mic over for you.
Hi, thank you for this one.
Thanks.
How do you incentivize the companies you work with to kind of push themselves toward like the designer founder world because they're not natural designers? And then when you have natural designers, how do you challenge them to like beef up their design so whether they bring somebody else in or just really get better design? How do you challenge them to be better designers in addition to designers?
Yeah. Well, a couple quick thoughts. One, we work very closely with, and I mentioned Designer Fund briefly, who we collaborated with on that table, the Leveling Up framework, and they run a program which is called Bridge, and Bridge is a way for young designers to basically get exposed to a broader set of both design tools as well as sort of the broader business skills. The other piece that I think relates to your question, and I remember sort of coming to this about a third of the way through our interviews, was this notion that, just as David Kelly used to talk about design was sort of bolted on in the 11th hour, in the early days, certainly of IDEO, I think actually designers have a very similar, almost mirror-like failure mode, which is bolting on business in the 11th hour. And when I sort of came to that, I was like, shit, like we're doing the same thing, just in opposite directions. And so I think getting more of that sort of business thinking into your design discussions earlier in the life cycle of your company will go a long way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a newly formed designer, entrepreneur, and I'm in the phase where I'm trying to monetize a business that I started that is kind of paving a new path to the design sprint process. And I'm sort of at a point where I feel like it's enough with the failure, but how do you push through that and keep going forward?
And what do you mean by enough with the failure?
Failing, I understand, is part of design, and pushing through and innovating and getting to that next level.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to fail. But there's times when you just feel like you had enough, like you can't seem to find the strength to pull through it.
Fair enough. So I think there's actually a failure fetish in Silicon Valley around sort of we celebrate failure as if sort of failure is a good thing. Failure is hard. Failure is really painful in my experience. I remember the first product I worked on at IDEO that didn't ship, and I vowed to myself I'd never work on another stillborn product in my life. And my sense is you can sort of get the air cover of failure if you're actually learning and improving and iterating quickly. And even Kelly sort of says like the whole fail fast thing, he sort of regrets, I think, sort of ever throwing that out there because it's really fail quickly to learn and be able to iterate towards a solution. So I think the failure fetish is misplaced, and I don't subscribe to it personally, but success is much better.
Probably last one.
More.
Hi, we were just discussing the word designer. Use that in a really broad sense.
I do.
And we're just curious, these founders, what kind of design background, or were they product designers or graphic designers, and with UX designers becoming such a big sort of movement right now, what do you find that is the path to?
Yeah. So one of the things in working on the book was this question of how to define design and designer. And there's sort of this frameworks of big D and little d, and design thinking versus the craft of design. And very quickly I came to the conclusion that I felt like design needed to be more inclusive, which risks, certainly people who have practiced in the craft or have been trained in graphic design or trained in user interface design say, well, why are you a designer if you're just sort of like whatever, tinkering in your garage with your MakerBot? But what I guess the way I've sort of created the sort of very fundamental definition that I hold is that a designer founder is someone who starts with human-centered first. There's lots of ways of starting businesses. There are businesses that start with technology first. There's businesses that start with business first, and there are businesses that start with users first. And so you are a designer, in my definition, as I described it for this book, as someone who starts with the user first. And if you're starting with the user in mind, in my opinion, you're a designer. And so I was intentionally broad in the definition. And I will tell you, I think it surprised me because I have friends who have worked with for literally 30 years who were classmates of mine at Stanford who were trained as industrial designers who found that definition actually pretty refreshing. But I think you have to start with the human. And whether you have a degree from RISD or CMU or Art Center or CCA, I spend a lot less time worrying about that.
Or SVA.
Yeah. Or SVA, exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, request for one more.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for your talk. I think the one thing that really struck out to me when you were talking about perfectionism, and if you could expand on that, because I've seen, for example, within everyone knows like Apple, very famous for Steve Jobs, very critical about products, and that push into the incredible extent, and that making them deliver things or incredible things.
Yeah.
Very little amount of time, and at the same time, you can argue that maybe sometimes perfectionism breaks people. So just
Yeah. I have two thoughts on that, and it's a great question, and I have a story as well. And one of the sort of earliest principles at IDEO is a guy, Jim Yurchenko, who used to get in the most heated battles with Steve Jobs when we would work on projects for Apple. He worked on the original mouse. He worked on many of the iMacs. Every time they would sort of get stuck, they would come, and Jim would usually work on these projects. And then they would get in a fight. And one of the most memorable fights was they were literally at a vendor looking at components for the inside of one of the iMacs, and Jobs basically insisted that it be made and anodized with this ridiculously insane and expensive process that had been used for counterweights on turntables. Remember, you guys have seen these beautiful counterweights. And Jobs literally pulled this thing off of their glass shelf in this contract manufacturer, said like, it has to be like this. And they got into this very long argument. And the thing that and by the way, this came up many, many times in my experience where you were literally making decisions about radii in the inside of a product that no one would ever see. And to me, it was never, in those interactions we were building those products or with people who worked on those products, the industrial designers, it was never about that actual detail. It was actually about the culture of caring. It was about the notion that like, if they weren't there, that you would still make a decision that was a thoughtful one. And so I think I guess reframe it in some ways less about, are you doing it because you care about, the specific pixel perfectness of the thing you're working on, or are you doing it because you care about the culture you're creating and think about sort of the boundaries of those? The second story that I'll just tell you that relates exactly to this is something that Joe Gebbia shared with us. This was back in one of our last interviews in December, and we met with him 4 or 5 times over the course of the project. And he and I were sort of bemoaning this sort of this pattern in Silicon Valley of the minimum viable product, because we all sort of like say the MVP today. And Joe was just pissed. He's like, if you went on a first date and someone asked you like, did you have a minimally viable time? How was that? Like, would you ever shoot for that? Not in a million years. And so make it great. So like minimum awesome product. And it's your sort of it's your first impression for so many of your users to make it great. And so I think it's a balance of those things. And you still have to have the minimum part of it, but it does have to be awesome. It has to be memorable. And when you get down to those picayune details, ask yourself whether you're being controlling because you can't let go of those design details, or whether you're just trying to instill a sense of care and culture. And in my opinion, Jobs was maniacal about that stuff. But you saw that sort of care and culture almost in fractal-like repetitions through other products. I mean, he would rewrite press releases the night before. He would literally swap out images that were going to go on billboards. because he didn't like the way one looked. And so I think it's a balance, but it has to be awesome and not crazy. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful.
Talk was awesome and not crazy at all. Thank you.